Jack Kemp once said at a meeting, there are three kinds of people in the world. People who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who wake up every single day and say, what happened? Well, looking around at the resumes of the people in this room, it's very clear you're the kind of folks that make things happen. So I'm particularly pleased to be here today and discuss some of these issues. First, we must recognize the reality of our political situation. We must be cognizant of it, and we must orient our policy to the political realities. There are problems we want to address, and there are obstacles to those problems. So much of politics is really about identity. It's not always what you say, but who you are, and all the things that go along with that identity. And we must be cognizant of that because we all of us, institutions and people, we have history. Our friends want to hear us and they want to listen, and they are likely to want to agree with us. Our opponents hear the same language coming from the same people or the same groups and have an opposite reaction because of who you are. We must approach the gun violence issue not by demonizing gun owners, not by demonizing gun owner organizations or industries that provide products to those gun owners. It is, if nothing else, a proven failure. When you attempt the same strategy and expect different results, that is the old definition of lunacy. So rule number one, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Our strategies that we have to focus on should involve gun violence prevention. They require gun owners to be supportive of the policies and not opponents. Rule two, after you stop digging, you're still in a hole. Let me make an admission against party interest to some. As a former lobbyist and chief spokesman for the firearm industry of America, I'm here to tell you all, behind every bullet wound, there was a delivery device called a firearm. There are 300 million plus firearms owned in this country by somewheres north of 120 million Americans. That is the political reality in this country. That's not the end, but that is what we have to recognize at the beginning. We must be particularly careful about our language as professionals and as policymakers. When I speak at colleges around this country, I always start with the very first term, gun control. Gun control means diametrically opposite things to the two camps involved in this issue. It's a fuzzy word. There are three distinct policy issues that we need to address and the public health community needs to address. And the solutions differ, and we conflate one problem and the solutions with that with the others all the time. They are, one, the negligent misuse of firearms. Two, the intentional criminal misuse of firearms. And third, and the most difficult, I think, is the mentally troubled misuse of firearms going in two different branches, the suicides and the homicidal rage frequently leading to suicide at the end. Which leads me to rule number three. It is never the gun per se that is the problem. It is always in whose hands are the guns. And if you ask the question correctly, that lends itself to then asking, how did that individual or type of individual obtain that gun, any gun, because all guns are essentially alike in that they fire a projectile at high speed downrange. That's what they're designed to do. That's why they're effective when used properly. That's why we issue them to every law enforcement officer in this country. That's why civilians who are concerned about self-protection carry them, buy them, and use them lawfully. The questions that we need to develop strategies for is how do we encourage citizens to do the right thing? What are the safety programs that we use today? Are they effective? Could we do better? How do we teach young children about firearm safety and responsibility? President Obama's Executive Order number 7. What about pre-adolescents? Are there different strategies for teaching them about firearms? What about young adults? What about adults? How are we going to locate the angry, disturbed people before they snap? What are the processes? What are the resources that will be necessary to help them? And perhaps as importantly, where will the money come from? Rule number 4, life is not free of risks. Life is all about competing risks, between and amongst risks. Why don't we just stop talking permanently about gun control and focus on gun violence reduction? I think we need to change the conversation in this country on this issue. 2 weeks ago, in a roundtable discussion with Vice President Biden, I asked him if he thought it was time in this country for us to have an adult conversation about the interrelationship between our war on drugs and gun violence. He said, yes, he does. Later on, Joe Scarborough came back to that question and asked him again, and he said, that's right, we need to have that conversation. Well, I can't think of a better group of folks to lead that conversation than the folks here in this room. I think we make a mistake in our country, an understandable one, of looking to our elected political leaders for leadership. Sometimes we're looking in the wrong place. I think that we have to look at alternative areas, alternative groups, other sources for many of those answers. As someone who's advised many politicians in his life, I've always said, don't get too far out front. Leadership is good after you get elected, but when you run every 2 years, or sometimes every 6, your ability to get too far out on too many different issues is really limited. And as I said last week to some reporter about last week's issues, I said, politics often trumps policy. Well, what do we learn from that? I think the answer is not to keep doing the same thing and try harder, rather, change the politics. Look at the issue differently. I kind of think of this discussion about drugs very much like I recall our discussion in this country back in the early 1980s about AIDS. How could we talk about AIDS and not talk about sex? And yet that's how the conversation began. How can we talk about gun violence in America, frankly, without talking about the war on drugs and about immigration? These issues are interrelated and inextricably interconnected to one another. And to have a discussion of one alone and ignore the others does a disservice to our country, to our people, because we're not looking at the problem. I'm as guilty as anyone. When we focus narrowly on any aspect of the gun debate, let's talk about gun shows. ATF suggests that 1 to 2% of transfers from non-federally licensed dealers at gun shows would be stopped by the NICS background check. Our organization supported last week the Manchin-Toomey bill. But let's face it, had it passed, had it been law, what would be the impact on crime? Somewhere between 0 and de minimis. All it would have done is shift the problem from the gun show to the 500,000 plus firearms stolen in this country every year. And I didn't hear a single senator in all the debate or a single individual talk about those 500,000 stolen firearms. What I'd like to know is, what happens to those guns after they're stolen? Some, no doubt, are used in crime. But after 3 years, we'd have 1.5 million of them. Where are they? Now, I suspect that some percentage, but what percentage of them, end up being resold back into the legitimate industry. If that's true, what strategies can we develop to make it harder, more difficult for those guns to make it back? If it's harder for those guns to re-enter the legitimate market, it makes the theft less likely in the first place. President Obama and Gabby Giffords both stated after the horrible tragedy that we must do something. I agree. But the question is, what is the something we must do? Shouldn't it be rationally related to the problem and not just sound like it's involved in this issue? Let's not let the prejudices of our past prevent us from moving forward on strategies and policies that will work despite certain obstacles. I look forward to working with you today and in the future. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Very useful. And thank you for articulating a series of questions we should be considering. Let's turn to Philip Cook from the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy.